So in this video, we're going to be replacing the piston ring in a small engine. This just so happens to be a chainsaw, and in reassembling it, we broke the piston ring. These are very fragile. They're made out of cast iron, which is a fragile material. So we need to be really careful whenever handling them and putting them on. So let's get started. Rings from China. They're about $3 for 2 of them, and they definitely took a while to get here. It took about a month for them to get here, but it was $3 and free shipping, which was good. And we weren't in a hurry. Now that we have these, we can just make sure these are the correct size for the piston, which these are, and they are the correct thickness as well. Now, when you're looking at the piston, right here is a little, I don't know what to call it. It's a little indent, kind of. And what this is that's to keep this aligned. Now there's little, almost like chamfers on the piston ring here, and those want to be cradling that little alignment pin there. So whenever we're going to put this on, we're basically just going to lay it on top here and then slowly start to stretch it over really carefully. Now we're going to start to work this on, and just remember you want this to be aligned with the little pin there. What we're gonna do is just really carefully start to work this around, starting kind of on one side and like kind of stretching the piston ring and working it around the piston. This is where you gotta be careful. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we got it on, that's good. Before we put this back together, we want to make sure the surfaces here are clean and will mesh together perfectly, so it'll have a seal. So what we need to do here is sand this flat, but first we're going to take this on the wire wheel and just clean it up. So now we can just take some steel wool and just clean this out and get rid of all that corrosion. So you can see this is all what came out of it. Now just a little bit of that is the steel wool, the little pieces of metal, but that is a lot of stuff that was in there, a bunch of corrosion that we've gotten off, and this is much cleaner now. One side of the cylinder, this is the one that I have used a little bit of Scotch-Brite on, and this is the other, and you can see there's a bunch of corrosion on this that we need to get off. So I'm just gonna take the Scotch-Brite and clean it up lightly. Now we're going to take a piece of flat glass like this with some sandpaper on it and just clean up the surfaces here. Alright, so now I don't see really any low spots on here. Now let's go ahead and flatten this. Alright, now we take a look at that. This one's done as well. So these two surfaces are flat. So before I start assembling things, you can see I have a new piece of cardboard because we want to keep all the dirt away. I'm just gonna wipe these down real quick just to make sure there's not any dirt particles in there. So whenever you're cleaning this, just be careful of the piston ring. You don't want this to catch and break the piston ring. Now we're going to put some engine assembly lube just on every single part that moves. Make sure everything is gonna be sliding nice and smooth, and also whenever we start the engine up for the first time, it's not going to be running dry. So if that part moves, just make sure to put some of this in there and get it moving. So on the cylinder wall, we're also going to put a little bit of this grease. That's going to make it easier to put the piston into here, just because this is going to be a tricky step. So for bigger engines, they make these. This is what you put over the piston to compress the piston ring, and then you could slide it into the cylinder. Now we made our own here out of an old pop can, and I've also seen people make them out of the ends of like a caulking tube, a piece of plastic, or you could buy them. So we're just gonna slide this over the piston ring and use this to compress it, and just have the top of the piston exposed a little bit. And now we're going to try to slide this on. Now we'll try to slide that in. Now I have that out. There we go. Now we got that piston to slide in. Now I'm just going to clean up some of these parts with rubbing alcohol just to make sure everything is really clean. And then what we're going to do is on this part here and this piece here, we're going to lay a bead of this RTV. This is a liquid, basically a liquid gasket. We'll put this on and let it sit till it just gets tacky. Then what we'll do is put this in place, and just a little bit, so where it just starts squeezing out the edge. Then we'll let it sit overnight, and then the next day we'll torque the bolts down. So you want to make sure that these bearings here are also nice and clean with rubbing alcohol. You can see where this normally sits between these two pieces here. It just gets a little squashed. So we want to make sure and put that back in the same place. So now with the RTV, what we're going to do is just put a thin coat over these rubber pieces here, and then lay it down a little bit heavier along the outside of this piece here. And on the second one here as well. And now we'll just lay down the bead here. So you want a good thick coat of the liquid gasket. So now it doesn't take long. This is just tacky, maybe been 3 or 5 minutes. And we can go ahead and start to put this together, but just very lightly. Lightly put it in place. Make sure these are in the correct orientation, right there. And then we'll also put on this bottom plate here. Now you can see it's starting to squeeze out the edges there. And now we'll let it sit an hour or more. So now we've let this gasket cure for about 24 hours. And now let's go ahead and put this back together. So we got the engine in here. Now, one thing you want to make sure whenever you put this back together, whenever you put the crank in, make sure it's facing the right direction. Might sound kind of silly, but we actually had it flipped the wrong way and we couldn't get the engine in. We were wondering why. And then we realized we had the whole entire crank in opposite. So we actually had to redo the gasket and redo everything, but just make sure it's on the right side because it actually will let you flip it around. So now we're gonna go ahead and put these bolts in here. This is what holds the cylinder on. So now I'm just going to put these in the rest of the way and just snug them up a little bit by hand. And then of course tomorrow morning, then we'll torque them to 10 foot-pounds with a torque wrench. In order to put the clutch back onto the chainsaw, it's important to get these pieces in the correct order. So the first piece we have here is this washer, and this just slides over the shaft right there. Then we have this outer piece here, and it has a needle bearing in there, and that just helps it slide real smooth. Slide that right on there, just like that. Now we can take the bigger washer, put that on top of that, and then we have the actual clutch right here, and then this will thread onto here. Remember, it's a reverse thread. I forgot about that. That would take a little while to get this on if you didn't know it was a reverse thread. So now we have this on. So this is our homemade spanner wrench. This is actually just a piece from a gear puller, and it just so happened that these two holes are perfectly the right size that slide on there. Now with my hand on the flywheel over here, I can grab this and tighten this, and that reverse thread really messes with you. So now we'll tighten that up. To put the carburetor on your chainsaw, it's a pretty simple process. To get started, we're just going to put this blue piece through the hole that it's supposed to be through. And then there's 2 holes in the carburetor that slide through these pins. And then the whole entire carburetor slides into place. Now with some of these fuel lines loose, we're able to maneuver them around and get them into the correct places that we want. This fuel line here connects right onto this part of the carburetor. And then we have some other fuel lines over here. And this one coming off of the bulb goes on this piece. It's this one right here. It's gonna be easier if I just take the carburetor off again. And we'll slide that into place just like that. So now we have our fuel lines hooked up. And next we need to put the throttle on. There we go. We got it. We'll slide this on again. And we can connect our fuel bulb as well. This is just held in by an Allen screw right here. Now we can go ahead and put these screws in right here, or these bolts in, and tighten these up. Now if I pull out the choke and then pull the trigger, it goes right back in. In order to put the magneto in, what we need to do is, of course, get the correct spacing. But first, we're just going to loosely put these bolts in by hand. So I'll line everything up and put that bolt through. Now that's also going through that black wire and making connection there. So now we can take this and start to thread that on. And then we'll do the same thing down here at the bottom. This one's a little bit harder because of the handle that you have to fight with the Allen wrench. But with the ball end on the end of this, it makes it much easier. So now, with those just barely starting to be snugged up, at least they're in place, we'll loosen them up a bit so we're still able to move it. And in order to get the correct spacing, what we need to do is just take a business card that has some thickness to it, and we'll just place this in between here. And what this is doing is, this is the magnet here on the flywheel. So when this comes by, you don't want it to actually touch the piece on here. It just wants to go by really quick. And it's creating electricity with those coils. So once we get that correct spacing, which is the thickness of this card, then I can go in with the Allen wrench and just tighten these bolts nice and tight. The names are the other way around. This is the magneto and this is the coil, but yeah, now we can go ahead and just tighten these up so whenever we remove that business card, the coil won't move. So with these nice and tight, that one's good, and the one down here, there we go. That one's also nice and tight. Let's remove this business card and see our distance. Whenever you put this top bolt in, there is a ground wire that is connected to the kill switch here, and that's how you're able to turn it on and off. So make sure that is connected with this bolt. Now if we go ahead and turn the magneto, you can see when that magnet passes, it's super close, but it's actually not touching. In order to get the kill switch in there, you may need to loosen this plate up again, just so that this will slide right in. This wire here has its own clip right here on the cylinder. Now let's go ahead and put the exhaust on. So you want to snug these up. To put the pull crank on, what we need to do is just slide this on. This is pretty simple. It just snaps on like that. So now with this crank on, we can crank this. So now we can go ahead and put the spark plug in there. So when we're tightening this one, now those short beeps mean that we are within 20% of our targeted torque. And then once we get to 10, which is our targeted torque, it'll do a long beep. Right there. There's something.